In the late 19th century, New York City was a place of rigid boundaries. Where you lived defined who you were. Private townhouses lined Fifth Avenue. Servants moved through back doors. Wealth depended on distance, privacy, and control. Then, on the far edge of Manhattan, something appeared that violated every rule. A massive apartment building rose at 72nd Street, surrounded by empty lots, dirt roads, and skepticism. Critics mocked it. Society dismissed it. Developers warned it would fail. No respectable family, they said, would ever share walls with strangers. But behind its gates, a radical idea was taking shape. This building promised mansion, living without the burden of ownership, privacy without isolation, luxury organized into a system. It separated servants from residents, noise from silence, chaos from comfort. It offered electricity before most homes had it, elevators when many feared them, and services so complete that daily life itself seemed to disappear. Its creator would die before seeing it finished. Its residents would later save it from demolition. Its walls would witness art, ambition, tragedy, and one of the most shocking crimes in modern history. This is not just the story of a building. It is the story of how New York learned to live differently. This is the story of the Dakota. If you want more documentary stories about the hidden histories behind iconic buildings, forgotten fortunes, and the private worlds of the powerful, make sure to subscribe. Leave a comment and tell us which landmark you want explored next. And if you're watching late at night, look closely at the buildings around you. Some of them are keeping secrets older than the city itself. Continuously, please 600 words per chapter. New York in the late 19th century was a city defined by separation. Wealth announced itself through distance, through walls, through the clear division between those who lived upstairs and those who worked below. The ideal life of the prosperous New Yorker unfolded inside a private townhouse, insulated from neighbors, insulated from noise, insulated from intrusion. To share walls with other families was to risk confusion of status. Apartments were tolerated only for the poor, the transient, or the newly arrived. Respectability required ownership, space, and solitude. Yet by the 1870s, Manhattan was beginning to strain under its own success. The population surged, land values climbed, townhouses grew narrower, taller, more expensive to maintain. Servants were harder to hire and harder to manage. Coal deliveries clogged streets, ice wagons rattled past bedroom windows at dawn. Every comfort required labor, and every labor required supervision. For families accustomed to ease, daily life had become a complex machine that demanded constant attention. Into this world stepped Edward Clark. Clark was not a social climber or a society figure. He was a lawyer by training, a businessman by temperament, and a visionary by instinct. As the president of the Singer Manufacturing Company, he had helped transform Isaac Singer's sewing machine into one of the most profitable consumer products in the world. The fortune Clark accumulated was vast, but more important was the mindset it produced. He believed in systems. He believed in efficiency. He believed that comfort could be engineered. Clark understood something many of his contemporaries did not. The problem facing wealthy New Yorkers was not a lack of luxury. It was the burden of managing it. What if, Clark wondered, all the advantages of a private mansion could be preserved while eliminating its inconveniences? What if servants could work without being seen, deliveries could arrive without disrupting daily life, and maintenance could occur without a household ever noticing? What if the building itself absorbed responsibility? The idea was radical. It was also deeply unsettling. Apartment houses already existed in New York, but they were modest affairs, designed for middle-class families willing to compromise. Clark envisioned something entirely different. A single structure vast enough to contain dozens of households, yet discreet enough to make each family feel alone. A place where privacy was not sacrificed to proximity, where grandeur was multiplied rather than diluted. He chose a site that seemed, at the time, absurd. The land at West 72nd Street lay far beyond the fashionable center of the city. The Upper West Side was still largely undeveloped, marked by open lots, scattered shanties, and rocky terrain. Society gatherings clustered miles to the south. Critics scoffed at the notion that anyone of means would travel so far simply to return home. Newspapers referred to the location as wilderness. Some openly mocked the proposal as folly. Clark did not retreat. Instead, he doubled down. If the location was distant, the building would compensate. If apartments were considered inferior, this one would redefine the category. Clark hired Henry Janeway Hardenberg, a young architect with a command of European precedent and a sensitivity to modern needs. Together, they began designing not merely a residence, but a new way of living. From the outset, scale mattered. The structure would occupy an entire city block frontage. Its walls would be thick enough to silence neighbors. Its layout would separate service functions from private life so completely that residents might forget how much labor sustained them. Courtyards would admit light and air. Elevators would eliminate the drudgery of stairs. Mechanical systems would operate invisibly, reliably, without drama. This was not an apartment house meant to blend in. It was meant to stand apart. Construction began in 1880, and almost immediately, the building attracted attention. Passers-by paused to stare at the rising masonry. Carriages slowed. Observers argued about whether it was madness or brilliance. The sheer mass of the structure seemed to challenge the city itself, as if declaring that the old rules no longer applied. Clark listened to the criticism and ignored it. He was building for a future that had not yet arrived, a city where proximity would become unavoidable, where efficiency would matter more than tradition, where wealth would demand not isolation, but orchestration. The Dakota, though it did not yet bear that name in the public imagination, was already doing what Clark intended. It was forcing New York to confront a possibility it had long resisted. That luxury did not have to mean separation. That privacy could exist within community. That progress, when carefully designed, could feel not like loss, but like relief. The gamble was enormous. The stakes were personal. And Clark would never know, at least not fully, whether his faith in this vision would be rewarded. The design of the building reflected Edward Clark's refusal to compromise. Every criticism that had ever been leveled against apartment living was treated not as an obstacle, but as a problem to be solved through architecture. Noise, crowding, lack of privacy, the visibility of labor, the mingling of social classes within a single structure, all of it was addressed deliberately, systematically, and at great expense. Henry Hardenberg approached the project with a European sensibility adapted to American expectations. He drew inspiration from Parisian apartment palaces, buildings that had long housed aristocrats without diminishing their status. But New York demanded something different. Americans were less accustomed to shared living, and more sensitive to any suggestion of social intrusion. The building would have to feel fortress-like without appearing hostile, grand without feeling theatrical, modern without appearing experimental. The solution began with the plan itself. Rather than a simple rectangular block, the structure wrapped around a vast internal courtyard. This space was not decorative alone. It was functional, a lung that brought light and air into the deepest parts of the building. More importantly, it allowed the separation of worlds. The courtyard was divided vertically into two distinct levels. The upper level, flush with street grade, belonged entirely to residents. It was quiet, orderly, and removed from labor. Below it, hidden from view, was an entirely different environment. Service ramps descended from both 72nd and 73rd Streets, allowing delivery wagons to enter, unload, and depart without ever appearing in the residents' domain. Groceries, coal, ice, furniture, and refuse moved through this lower level unseen. Servants passed through their own corridors. Residents could come and go without encountering the machinery that sustained their comfort. The building did not merely contain labor, it concealed it. This separation was not accidental. It was a direct response to earlier apartment houses, where service carts cluttered shared spaces and eroded the illusion of refinement. Clark understood that, for his tenants, dignity mattered as much as luxury. They would accept shared walls only if the experience felt elevated, controlled, and insulated from disorder. The construction itself was equally deliberate. At a time when steel frame construction was beginning to appear, the Dakota relied on traditional load-bearing masonry. The foundation walls were massive, measuring several feet thick, giving the structure a sense of permanence more often associated with medieval fortifications than residential buildings. Iron beams and concrete floors added strength, while layers of compacted material between floors provided soundproofing and fire resistance. These choices made the building slower and more expensive to construct. They also made it quiet. Within each apartment, Hardenberg refined the balance between formality and convenience. Drawing from French precedents, rooms were arranged in sequences, allowing grand spaces to flow into one another for entertaining. At the same time, corridors provided alternative routes, ensuring that daily movement did not require passing through every room. Servants could reach any space through back passages without disturbing family life. Guests could circulate without intrusion. The architecture anticipated behavior. Orientation mattered as well. Principal rooms faced outward toward the streets and the park, capturing light, views, and prestige. Dining rooms, kitchens, and secondary spaces faced inward toward the courtyard. Every apartment received light from at least two directions, a rarity in Manhattan at the time. Air moved, shadows shifted, the building breathed. Mechanical systems reinforced the promise of effortlessness. The Dakota would generate its own electricity at a time when gas lighting still dominated much of the city. A central heating system eliminated the need for individual furnaces, coal deliveries, and soot-filled basements. Hydraulic elevators carried residents upward smoothly, removing the physical burden that had long defined urban living. Even risk was engineered out of sight. The power plant was placed beneath a garden on the adjacent lot, physically separated from the main structure. If a boiler failed, the apartments would remain safe. The placement was practical, but also psychological. Clark knew his tenants would need reassurance before entrusting their families to unfamiliar technologies. By the early 1880s, the building rising at 72nd Street had become impossible to ignore. It was unlike anything New York had seen. Not simply larger, but smarter. Not merely luxurious, but intentional. The Dakota was not promising novelty for its own sake. It was offering something far more seductive. A life where comfort did not require vigilance, where status did not demand effort, where the city's chaos stopped at the gate and never crossed the threshold. By the time the structure reached its full height, Edward Clark had moved beyond architecture. He was designing a complete domestic ecosystem, one that would make traditional townhouse living feel inefficient by comparison. The Dakota was not meant to house families who wanted to manage their own lives in miniature. It was meant for those who wished to be relieved of management altogether. Inside, no two apartments were exactly alike. This was not a repetition of units stacked floor upon floor. Clark encouraged customization on a scale unheard of in New York residential construction. Walls could be moved, rooms could be merged or divided. Families could shape their homes according to taste, habit, and social ritual. The result was a building that felt personal despite its size, intimate despite its population. The craftsmanship reflected this philosophy. Floors were laid in intricate patterns of marble, oak, mahogany, and cherry wood. Door frames and moldings were carved by hand, echoing European techniques that had largely disappeared from American construction. Fireplaces featured marble mantels, each with its own design. Ceilings were paneled in carved oak, detailed enough that most residents would never consciously register the labor involved. Luxury here was not loud. It was embedded. Stories circulated almost immediately. One persistent legend claimed that Clark specified sterling silver inlays for the floors of his own apartment. Whether this was ever realized remains uncertain. Clark died before the building opened, and his apartment passed to other occupants. Yet the story endured, less as a factual claim than as a symbol of the mindset behind the project. The Dakota was not constrained by moderation. What truly distinguished the building, however, were its services. On the ground floor, Clark installed a full dining establishment intended to rival the finest restaurants in the city. Contemporary accounts described a space modeled after an English baronial hall, with marble floors, carved oak paneling, bronze relief work, and a massive stone fireplace anchoring the room. Adjacent spaces allowed for private dinners and separate accommodations for ladies. Residents could dine communally or entertain guests without ever leaving the building. For those who preferred privacy, the arrangement was equally refined. A network of dumbwaiters connected the dining facilities to individual apartments. Meals prepared by professional staff could be delivered directly to a family's kitchen, hot and ready to serve. The convenience of a grand hotel was combined with the privacy of a private home. Maintaining this system required an army. Clark planned for approximately 150 employees to work within the building. Doormen and elevator operators were only the visible layer. Behind them labored a resident housekeeper overseeing maids, a laundress with her own staff, a tailor, a carpenter, painters, a cabinet maker, an electrician, a plumber, and a glazier. Every trade required to sustain daily life existed within the walls. Laundry service illustrated the level of attention residents could expect. Soiled garments were collected in wicker baskets, cleaned, pressed, mended, and returned separated by pink tissue paper. Buttons were replaced, tiers repaired. Families accustomed to supervising servants now found themselves supervising nothing at all. The upper floors housed this hidden workforce. Dormitories for male and female staff occupied spaces above the private apartments. Laundry facilities stretched toward the roof. These areas were functional, unadorned, designed for efficiency rather than display. They formed a parallel world, one that ensured the gracious calm below never faltered. Even leisure was planned. Portions of the roof were set aside as play areas for children, offering safety and fresh air in a neighborhood still lacking public amenities. On the adjacent lot above the mechanical plant, Clark envisioned tennis courts, croquet lawns, and gardens. Residents could enjoy outdoor pursuits without venturing into unfinished streets. At the heart of it all was the heating system. Steam radiators warmed every apartment from a central source. No coal to order, no furnaces to tend, no soot to clean. Winter, which had long dictated household labor, became irrelevant. Clark's ambition was not merely to impress, it was to liberate, to remove from daily life every task that distracted from living itself. The Dakota was not an apartment house, it was a machine for comfort, a carefully calibrated environment where wealth functioned smoothly, invisibly, and without friction. The only remaining question was whether anyone would believe in it. Edward Clark never saw the Dakota come to life. In the autumn of 1882, as the building's walls stood complete and craftsmen labored on its final details, Clark fell ill at his country estate in Cooperstown. He was 70 years old. For more than 2 years, he had watched his most ambitious project rise from a distant, derided idea into a physical reality dominating the Upper West Side. He had defended it against ridicule. He had funded it without compromise. He had trusted that its logic would eventually prevail. On October 14, 1882, Edward Clark died of malarial fever. The Dakota was still unfinished. Nearly 2 years of work remained. The man who had conceived it would never walk through its courtyard, never dine in its baronial hall, never occupy the apartment designed for him. His death transformed the building into something stranger still, a monument to a vision whose author would never enjoy its rewards. Clark's fortune was immense. Estimates placed his estate between $25 and $50 million, a staggering sum for the period. The bulk of his real estate holdings, including the Dakota, passed to his grandson, Edward Severin Clark, a boy of just 12. Because a child could not manage such a property, trustees assumed control. Their task was clear: complete the building according to Clark's plans. They did. Construction continued through 1883 despite labor, strikes, and periodic delays. Hardenberg remained closely involved, overseeing the finishing work that would transform masonry and machinery into habitable space. Floors were laid, doors were hung, mechanical systems were tested. By the summer of 1884, the building stood ready. Meanwhile, the city around it was changing. The Dakota's very presence had announced that the Upper West Side was no longer peripheral. Investors followed. Streets that had been empty only a few years earlier began to fill with shops, services, and traffic. In 1884, the elevated railway extended further uptown, shrinking distances that had once seemed insurmountable. What had been wilderness became neighborhood. When leasing terms were announced, the reaction surprised even optimists. Annual rents ranged from $1,500 to $5,000, placing the Dakota firmly within the upper tier of the market. Yet demand was immediate. By September, a quarter of the apartments had already been rented. When the building officially opened in late October, every unit was spoken for. Not a single vacancy remained. The tenants were precisely the class Clark had anticipated: lawyers, brokers, merchants, manufacturers, and professionals. Prosperous, but not aristocratic. Comfortable, but not flamboyant. They were not members of New York's most exclusive social circles, but they were secure enough to recognize value when they saw it. The Dakota offered something no townhouse could: relief. Early reports confirmed that the systems worked. Elevators ran smoothly. Heating was reliable. Services materialized as promised. Residents found themselves free from the endless logistics that had defined domestic life. The building handled problems before they were noticed. Criticism softened into praise. Newspapers reversed themselves. The New York Daily Graphic called it one of the most perfect apartment houses in the world. The Real Estate Record praised both architect and client. What had been mocked as folly in 1880 was hailed as foresight by 1885. Yet Edward Clark's absence lingered. His portrait hung somewhere within the building, a quiet reminder of the man whose faith had made it possible. Residents moved through spaces shaped by decisions he had made. They lived the life he had imagined, largely unaware of how much resistance that imagination had overcome. The Dakota had proven something profound. Wealthy New Yorkers would accept apartment living if it offered dignity rather than compromise. They would share walls if privacy was preserved. They would embrace technology if it simplified life rather than complicated it. Clark had gambled his reputation on an idea that did not yet exist. He had died before it could vindicate him. But as tenants settled into their new routines and the building began to hum with daily life, his vision ceased to be theory. It became normal. For the next 7 decades, the Dakota remained under the control of a single family: Edward Severin Clark, the grandson who had inherited the building as a child, grew into the role of steward rather than speculator. By the time he assumed direct control in the early 1890s, the building had already secured its reputation. The experiment was no longer an experiment. The waiting list was real. The neighborhood had matured. The gamble had paid off. Edward Severin Clark did not need the Dakota to generate profit. The Singer fortune continued to produce wealth on a scale few landlords could imagine. This financial independence shaped every decision that followed. Rents rose slowly, if at all. Long-term tenants found their payments unchanged for years, sometimes decades. Families settled in and stayed. Children grew up in the same apartments, later taking units of their own within the building. The Dakota developed the rhythms of a small village, bound together by shared space and long memory. Between its opening in 1884 and the onset of the Great Depression, the Dakota experienced something almost unheard of in New York real estate. It never stood empty. For 45 consecutive years, every apartment remained occupied. This stability reinforced the building's character. It was not a place of turnover or transience. It was a place of continuity. Cultural life followed naturally. Members of the Steinway family took apartments, reinforcing the building's association with music and the arts. Patrons of opera and symphony lived alongside industrialists and professionals. The Dakota was elegant without being ostentatious, refined without rigidity. It attracted people who valued privacy and seriousness over display. Edward Severin Clark died in 1933, just weeks before the building's 50th anniversary. He left no children. 2 residents who had moved in during the Dakota's first year were still living there at the time of his death. The building had become a repository of lived history, its story measured not in decades, but in lifetimes. Ownership passed to Edward Severin's youngest brother, Stephen Carlton Clark. Like his grandfather, Stephen approached the world methodically. He was deeply involved in cultural institutions, serving as a founding trustee of the Museum of Modern Art and later establishing the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. He collected art with discernment and seriousness. Under his stewardship, the Dakota changed very little. The original hydraulic elevators continued to operate well into the mid-20th century. Maintenance was handled quietly and comprehensively. The Clarks answered to no board, no shareholders, no outside authority. The building existed according to its own internal logic, but time alters even the most carefully designed systems. As the 20th century progressed, the elaborate services that had once defined Dakota living began to fade. The resident laundry service disappeared first, followed by tailoring and the large domestic staff overseen by the housekeeper. Social patterns changed. Families no longer required the same level of constant service. Professional staff became expensive. Independence replaced ritual. After the Second World War, the grand dining room closed permanently. It had never been profitable. What Edward Clark had designed as an inducement for hesitant families was no longer necessary. Residents preferred their own kitchens or the city's restaurants. The vast basement operation fell silent. By the 1950s, the servants' quarters on the upper floors were converted into apartments. The workforce shrank dramatically. From the original 150 employees, fewer than 50 remained by 1960. The hidden world that had once sustained effortless luxury contracted into a leaner, quieter operation. The tenant population shifted as well. Diplomats, publishers, and figures from the theater and music world began to dominate the roster. The building's proximity to Broadway made it especially attractive to performers. Its thick walls and generous rooms offered privacy and quiet rare in Manhattan. Stephen Clark himself never lived in the Dakota. He maintained a townhouse across Central Park. As he aged, residents grew increasingly anxious about what would happen when his stewardship ended. Invitations were sent, gifts exchanged, polite inquiries made. Clark offered no hints. When he died in September 1960, the uncertainty ended abruptly. His will left the Dakota not to heirs, but to a charitable foundation he had established decades earlier. What initially seemed stable soon revealed a fatal flaw. Under New York law, the foundation could not retain property that failed to generate profit. The Dakota, cherished and preserved, had never truly been profitable. Within months, the building faced a threat far greater than skepticism or fashion. For the first time in its history, its survival was genuinely in question. The danger arrived suddenly and without sentiment. In December of 1960, only weeks after Stephen Clark's death, word spread quietly among the residents that the Dakota had been offered for sale. The charitable foundation that now owned the building was bound by law to divest itself of an asset that did not produce sufficient income. Prestige carried no legal weight. History offered no protection. What mattered was profit, and the Dakota had never been run to maximize it. The prospective buyer was exactly the kind of man the residents feared. William Zeckendorf was one of New York's most aggressive developers, known for replacing aging structures with towering slabs of modern steel and glass. To him, buildings like the Dakota represented inefficiency. Thick walls wasted rentable space. Courtyards produced no revenue. Low rents and long-term tenants were sentimental liabilities. In Zeckendorf's view, the building's greatest value lay not in what stood there, but in what could replace it. When residents learned of the offer, panic followed. Many had lived in the Dakota for decades. Some had spent their entire adult lives within its walls. They had raised children there, buried spouses, watched the city transform from behind the same windows. Eviction was not an abstraction. It was personal. An emergency meeting was called in the long-abandoned dining room. Elderly tenants wept openly. Others shouted in disbelief. Some could not imagine surviving a move at their age. The marble floors that had once hosted formal dinners now echoed with fear and anger. What Edward Clark had built as a sanctuary was on the verge of erasure. Two residents emerged as unlikely leaders. Ernest Gruss, an international lawyer with experience in diplomacy and negotiation, and Charles Douglas Jackson, a former government official skilled in strategy and persuasion. They understood that emotion alone would not save the building. The Dakota would survive only if its residents could act collectively and quickly. They faced enormous obstacles. The price was staggering. The timeline was brutal. The legal structure of the sale favored demolition. Yet the tenants possessed something developers underestimated: influence, connections, public voice. Negotiations unfolded under pressure. Another developer briefly entered the picture, intensifying the threat. Headlines began to appear. Preservationists took notice. The Dakota was no longer just a residence. It was becoming a symbol of what New York was willing to lose. In early 1961, the residents formed a cooperative corporation. It was a radical transformation. Tenants who had paid modest rents for decades were now being asked to become owners, responsible not only for their apartments, but for the building itself. The financial burden was heavy. Monthly charges would rise sharply. Some residents could not afford the transition. A few left. Others made sacrifices, sold assets, borrowed money, or accepted smaller units. The choice was stark: ownership or displacement. In November of that year, the deal was completed. The residents purchased the Dakota for more than any developer had offered. The wrecking ball was turned away. For the first time since its construction, the building belonged not to a single family, but to the people who lived inside it. Survival came at a cost. The adjacent lot, once home to gardens and recreational grounds, was sold. A modern apartment tower rose there soon after, efficient, anonymous, and utterly devoid of character. It stood as a reminder of what might have replaced the Dakota itself: ownership brought new realities. Under the Clarks, maintenance had been quietly subsidized. Now the true cost of preservation revealed itself. Aging systems required repair. Elevators installed in the 19th century demanded expensive upgrades. Roofs failed. Facades needed restoration. In the 1970s, residents approved major assessments, paying thousands per apartment to keep the building functional. Rules followed. A board of directors was established. Prospective buyers would be screened. Financial stability mattered. Discretion mattered. The cooperative was not interested in turnover or spectacle. It sought continuity, much like the Clark family before it. By saving the Dakota, the residents had preserved more than a building. They had preserved a way of living that New York no longer knew how to create. Thick walls, generous spaces, controlled access, and a culture of privacy became increasingly rare as the city rushed toward efficiency and scale. The irony was unmistakable. What developers once dismissed as obsolete had become irreplaceable. The Dakota survived not because it adapted to modern New York, but because it resisted it. And in doing so, it set the stage for an entirely new chapter in its life, one that would transform it from an address of quiet stability into a place known around the world. By the late 1960s, the Dakota had already become an artifact of another era. While the city around it modernized at a relentless pace, the building remained stubbornly unchanged. Its thick walls muted the noise of traffic. Its courtyard preserved a sense of inward calm. From the street, the structure still looked more like a European fortress than a Manhattan residence. It was precisely this quality that caught the attention of Hollywood. In 1967, a young director arrived in New York searching for a building that could convey unease without explanation. Roman Polanski was preparing to adapt Ira Levine's novel Rosemary's Baby, a psychological horror story that depended not on monsters, but on atmosphere. The setting needed to feel plausible, lived in, respectable. It also needed to feel old, imposing, and faintly threatening. Polanski wanted a building that suggested secrets simply by existing. He found it at 72nd Street. Levin's novel had already acknowledged the Dakota indirectly. In the book, a character warns the protagonists against moving into a fictional apartment house by suggesting they choose the Dakota instead, implying that the real building was the safer option. Polanski reversed the implication. He used the Dakota's exterior to represent the Bramford, collapsing fiction and reality into a single image. Filming began in August of 1967. The Dakota's management refused to allow interior shooting, concerned about disruption and privacy. Polanski did not object. He needed only the exterior. The arched entrance, the courtyard glimpsed through the passageway, the steep roofline rising against the sky. These elements established the film's mood immediately. The building did not need embellishment. It carried its own weight. When Rosemary's Baby was released in 1968, audiences responded to its slow, creeping dread. The Dakota became inseparable from that experience. Millions of viewers who had never heard of Edward Clark or Henry Hardenberg now recognized the building instantly. It was no longer just a prestigious address. It was a symbol of hidden menace. The association lingered. Some residents found the attention uncomfortable. They had not chosen to live in a cinematic nightmare. Others accepted it as part of the building's evolving identity. The Dakota had always possessed a theatrical quality. Polanski had merely revealed what was already there. The building looked like a place where extraordinary things could happen. The film suggested what kind. This new visibility coincided with a broader cultural shift. The Dakota began attracting a different kind of resident. Artists, musicians, actors, and writers found its combination of privacy and grandeur appealing. Thick walls allowed for late-night rehearsals. Spacious rooms accommodated pianos, studios, and libraries. The cooperative's emphasis on discretion suited people who wished to live quietly despite public lives. One of the earliest and most influential of these residents was Boris Karloff. By the time he moved into the Dakota in the 1950s, Karloff was internationally famous for portraying Frankenstein's monster. Some residents initially worried that having a film actor in the building might erode its tone. Those fears quickly vanished. Karloff lived quietly, spoke softly, and behaved with impeccable courtesy. He remained in the building until his death in 1969. His presence set a precedent. Over the following years, the Dakota welcomed figures whose names carried cultural weight rather than industrial power. Lillian Gish, a pioneer of silent film, took an apartment, bringing with her the living memory of cinema's earliest days. Judy Garland lived there briefly during a turbulent period of her life. Lauren Bacall arrived in the early 1960s and stayed for more than half a century, becoming one of the building's anchors. Leonard Bernstein occupied an apartment overlooking Central Park, composing music within walls designed to contain sound. The building's identity was shifting. It was no longer simply a refuge for prosperous families. It was becoming a haven for creative lives. By the early 1970s, this transformation was unmistakable. The Dakota was known not just for who lived there, but for the kind of lives it supported. Quiet, serious, inward. Fame existed, but it was not performed. Privacy was not advertised, it was enforced. In 1973, an apartment on the 7th floor became available. It had belonged to the actor Robert Ryan, who was dying of cancer. The space stretched nearly half the length of the building, with views across Central Park and a sense of gravity that few modern apartments could match. A young English musician and his wife were searching for a home. They wanted history. They wanted solidity. They wanted something that felt removed from the noise of the world. They would find it behind the gates of the Dakota. John Lennon and Yoko Ono arrived at the Dakota at a moment when both were seeking refuge rather than attention. They had been living in the West Village, but the neighborhood no longer offered the anonymity they wanted. Fame followed them everywhere. Lennon, in particular, was exhausted by it. What he wanted now was space, silence, and a sense of history. The Dakota offered all three. The apartment they viewed on the 7th floor had belonged to the actor Robert Ryan. It was vast, running nearly the length of the building, with multiple bedrooms and long sightlines across Central Park. Yet what struck Lennon most was not the size or the view. It was the atmosphere, the heavy brass switches, the sit-down elevators operated by uniformed attendants, the dark wood paneling that recalled Victorian interiors. To Lennon, it felt familiar. It reminded him of Liverpool, of his childhood, of a world before celebrity had fractured his life into spectacle. The cooperative board hesitated. Lennon's past followed him. Drug charges in England. The fear of loud parties, crowds, amplifiers, disruption. The Dakota prized discretion above all else. But once approved, Lennon and Ono proved the concerns unfounded. They lived quietly. They gave no parties. They sought privacy with near obsession. Privacy, however, was difficult to maintain. Fans quickly learned where Lennon lived. Despite the guarded entrance and the gatehouse, admirers lingered outside. Some slipped in behind residents. Others rang doorbells, wandering the corridors in search of their hero. Lennon responded with patience. He signed autographs. He spoke kindly. He never fully resented the devotion, even when it intruded. Other residents were less forgiving. Lauren Bacall was known to confront loiterers directly, protecting the building's boundaries with the authority of someone who had lived there long enough to feel responsible for it. Over time, Lennon and Ono expanded their footprint within the Dakota. They acquired multiple units. Some were used for storage, others as studios or guest space. Ono established her business offices on the ground floor in a space known as Studio One, from which she managed their finances, projects, and investments. The Dakota became not just their home, but the center of their private world. In October of 1975, that world shifted. On John Lennon's 35th birthday, Yoko Ono gave birth to their son, Sean. Lennon had another son, Julian, from his first marriage, but the pressures of fame and distance had strained that relationship. Sean's birth awakened something in him. Lennon made a decision that surprised the music industry. He stepped away. For the next 5 years, John Lennon retired from recording. He became, by his own description, a house husband. While Ono worked downstairs, Lennon stayed in the apartment with their son. He baked bread. He cooked meals. He supervised the nanny. He watched the seasons change over Central Park from the windows of the Dakota. His guitar hung untouched for months. Fame receded. Domestic life took its place. Neighbors encountered a version of Lennon few outsiders ever saw. A quiet man pushing a stroller through the courtyard. A polite eccentric attending the building's potluck dinners. A father absorbed in ordinary routines. Roberta Flack, who lived next door, became close to the family. Sean would later call her Aunt Roberta. Within the Dakota's walls, celebrity dissolved into familiarity. Lennon's legal battles also eased. In 1976, after years of immigration disputes, he received his green card. For the first time since leaving England, he could leave the United States without fear of being barred from returning. The sense of relief was profound. In 1978, Lennon and Ono purchased a large dairy farm in upstate New York. Lennon seemed to be building a life deliberately removed from the machinery of fame. Then, in 1980, something changed. While traveling alone in Bermuda, Lennon picked up an acoustic guitar. Songs began to come, unforced and abundant. He called Ono from the island, playing new compositions over the phone. She had been writing as well. They decided to record together, alternating tracks, framing the album as a conversation between equals. Lennon returned to New York energized. He booked studio time. He assembled musicians. For the first time in 5 years, he re-entered the world he had left behind. The album, Double Fantasy, was released in November 1980. Reviews were mixed, but sales were strong. Lennon gave interviews again, speaking openly about fatherhood, retreat, and renewal. He talked about future records. He talked about touring. He talked about time. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon and Yoko Ono spent the afternoon working at the recording studio on a song of hers called Walking on Thin Ice. Lennon added a guitar part that crackled with urgency. When they finished, he turned to her and said he thought she had just recorded her first #1 hit. They left the studio and headed home. Across Central Park, the Dakota waited, exactly as it always had. If you stand on Central Park West and look up at the Dakota, it is impossible not to notice what lies directly across the street. Just beyond the traffic and the iron fence, the trees of Central Park open into a tear-shaped clearing. Today, it is one of the most visited memorials in New York. But in 1980, it was simply part of the route John Lennon and Yoko Ono walked almost every day. On the night of December 8, 1980, Lennon and Ono returned to the Dakota shortly before 11. Lennon stepped out of the limousine and paused, as he often did, to greet fans gathered near the entrance. One of them asked for an autograph. Lennon signed it. Moments later, as he turned toward the archway, 5 gunshots shattered the routine. Lennon collapsed just steps from the door that would have taken him home. He was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital. He was pronounced dead minutes later. The Dakota did not close its gates that night. Police sealed the entrance. Neighbors watched from windows and corridors as sirens flooded the street. By morning, the sidewalk outside the building was covered in flowers, candles, handwritten notes. Fans arrived from across the city and around the world. The Dakota, long associated with privacy and discretion, had become the epicenter of collective grief. In the days that followed, Yoko Ono made a series of decisions that shaped how Lennon would be remembered. There would be no public funeral, no spectacle. Instead, she asked fans to gather quietly and think of peace. On December 14th, hundreds of thousands of people stood in silence across the world for 10 minutes. In Central Park, they gathered near the place where John and Yoko had walked together so often. It was there that the idea for a permanent memorial took root. The section of Central Park across from the Dakota was neglected at the time, like much of the park in the late 1970s. Paths were cracked, trees were sparse, yet it held meaning. It was part of Lennon's daily life. Yoko Ono wanted to transform it not into a statue, but into something living, a space that reflected Lennon's ideals rather than his image. In 1981, she invited countries around the world to contribute to what she called a garden of peace. The response was overwhelming. More than 120 nations sent trees, plants, stones, and soil. Britain sent an oak. Canada sent maples. The Netherlands sent tulip bulbs. Monaco sent dogwoods. The park itself contributed strawberry plants, a quiet reference to a song Lennon had written years earlier, inspired by a children's home near where he grew up in Liverpool. At the heart of the garden, artisans from Naples created a circular mosaic of black and white stone. At its center, a single word: imagine. The memorial was named Strawberry Fields. It opened officially in 1985, on what would have been Lennon's 45th birthday. Ono stood with her son Sean, city officials, musicians, and representatives from around the world. The garden was not framed as a monument to death, but as an invitation to reflection, a place meant to be used, not revered from a distance. From the windows of the Dakota, the mosaic was visible. Flowers appeared on it daily. Musicians gathered. Fans sang together, often softly, sometimes not. The area was designated a quiet zone, but it was rarely silent. Music filled the space where words failed. For the Dakota, Lennon's death marked a turning point. The building had always been known, but now it was iconic. Tourists lined the sidewalk year-round. The gatehouse became one of the most photographed in the city. The cooperative board tightened security. Privacy became more fiercely guarded than ever. Yet the building endured, as it always had. Residents continued their lives behind its walls. Elevators rose and fell. The courtyard echoed with footsteps. Across the street, strawberry fields bloomed and was replanted, year after year. The Dakota and the memorial now faced each other across Central Park West, one a fortress of stone and silence, the other an open space of memory and song. Together, they formed a conversation between private life and public loss, between a man who sought refuge from fame and a world that refused to let him disappear. The city moved on, but it never forgot. More than a century after it first opened its gates, the Dakota remains an anomaly in New York City. Buildings around it have risen and fallen, styles have changed, fortunes have evaporated and reappeared in new forms, yet the Dakota stands much as it always has. Its roofline still cuts a jagged silhouette against the sky. Its courtyard still absorbs the noise of the street. Its gates still open selectively and close with quiet finality. In 1969, the city formally recognized what residents had long understood. The Dakota was designated a New York City landmark. In the years that followed, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places and later named a National Historic Landmark. The structure, once ridiculed as Clark's Folly, was now protected as a cultural treasure. Preservation, however, came with limits. Exterior changes required approval. Modern conveniences could not be added casually. When the slate roof began to fail, restoration costs reached staggering sums. Residents learned that preserving history demanded patience and sacrifice. Inside, much remained unchanged. The original elevators continued to operate, attended by uniformed operators, long after automated systems became standard elsewhere. The courtyard fountain continued to run. The rhythm of life remained inward-facing, controlled, deliberate. The Dakota did not adapt quickly. It did not need to. Its appeal lay precisely in what it refused to become. The cooperative board, formed during the building's rescue in the early 1960s, grew increasingly influential. Ownership in the Dakota did not guarantee entry. Prospective buyers were interviewed, scrutinized, and sometimes rejected without explanation. Financial strength mattered, but so did temperament. The building valued discretion, stability, and respect for privacy above celebrity or wealth alone. Over time, the list of rejected applicants became nearly as famous as the list of residents. Pop stars, actors, athletes, and moguls were turned away. Some had the money, some had the fame. What they lacked, in the board's judgment, was fit. The Dakota had learned through experience that fame could be accommodated, but spectacle could not. This selectivity only deepened the building's mystique. Apartments sold for prices that would have astonished Edward Clark. Maintenance fees climbed into six figures, yet demand never waned. The Dakota was no longer merely prestigious, it was symbolic. To live there was to participate in a lineage, to inhabit a structure that had witnessed the transformation of New York itself. Outside, tourists gathered daily. They photographed the archway. They waited quietly near the gatehouse. Some came because of cinema, drawn by the lingering shadow of Rosemary's Baby. Others came because of music, tracing the final steps of John Lennon. Still others came simply because the Dakota felt important, even without knowing exactly why. Inside, life continued much as it always had. Residents passed one another in hallways without spectacle. Conversations remained private. The building enforced a culture of silence that protected its inhabitants from the city's relentless exposure. In a place where everything seemed for sale, discretion became the ultimate luxury. Across the street, Strawberry Fields evolved into one of Central Park's most visited spaces. The mosaic weathered and was repaired. Flowers were replaced daily by strangers. On John Lennon's birthday, and on the anniversary of his death, crowds gathered to sing, to mourn, to remember. The sounds drifted upward toward the Dakota's windows, reminders that the building's history was now inseparable from the world beyond its walls. Yoko Ono remained in the Dakota for decades, looking out across the park at the memorial she had created. When she finally left in the early 2020s, the connection between the building and its most famous resident did not dissolve. It had already become permanent. The Dakota now exists at the intersection of memory and wealth, privacy and myth. It has been many things to many people: a bold experiment in living, a refuge for artists, a cinematic symbol of unease, a site of unimaginable loss. Through all of it, the building has remained fundamentally what Edward Clark intended: a place designed to remove friction from life, to shelter its inhabitants from intrusion, to make living feel deliberate rather than accidental. In a city that reinvents itself endlessly, the Dakota stands as a refusal. It refuses speed. It refuses transparency. It refuses to explain itself. It asks only to endure. From its windows, residents can still look out across Central Park and see a city transformed far beyond what Clark could have imagined. Yet the essential promise remains intact. Behind its gates, life unfolds quietly, protected by stone, history, and an unbroken belief that some things are worth preserving exactly as they are. The Dakota was never meant to be fashionable. From its earliest days, it stood slightly apart from the city it served, resistant to trends, immune to urgency. That quality, once ridiculed, became its greatest strength. As New York accelerated through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the building's refusal to change turned it into a fixed point in a constantly shifting landscape. Around it, Manhattan densified. Glass towers rose where masonry once stood. Apartments grew smaller, even as prices climbed. Luxury came to mean height, views, and amenities stacked vertically. The Dakota offered none of this. It did not promise novelty, it promised continuity. Inside, life moved according to rhythms established long before modern New York existed. The sit-down elevators slowed movement deliberately. The courtyard softened sound. Hallways absorbed footsteps rather than amplifying them. These were not accidents. They were features designed to impose calm. In a city increasingly defined by exposure and speed, the Dakota preserved the experience of retreat. This retreat became its defining appeal. The building's cooperative board continued to act as gatekeeper, enforcing standards that often baffled outsiders. Rejections were rarely explained. Rumors circulated endlessly. Some claimed the board feared paparazzi. Others suggested moral judgments or lifestyle concerns. In truth, the criteria were simpler and stricter. Would a resident respect silence? Would they protect the privacy of others? Would they understand that the building's value lay not in being seen, but in being left alone? Those who passed through the gates tended to stay. Turnover remained low. Apartments changed hands quietly, often privately. The Dakota resisted becoming a commodity even as its market value soared. It was traded less like property and more like stewardship. Outside, the building's meaning continued to evolve. To architecture historians, it stood as a landmark in American residential design, proof that apartment living could achieve the dignity once reserved for private houses. To preservationists, it was a victory over a period when New York seemed eager to erase its past. To film lovers, it remained inseparable from a story of paranoia and dread, its silhouette forever linked to a fictional evil that felt disturbingly plausible. To music fans, it was sacred ground, the place where John Lennon lived his final years and where the world lost him. These interpretations overlapped without canceling one another. The Dakota absorbed them all. Tourists still gathered outside the gates daily. Some whispered, some cried, some sang. Security maintained distance without hostility. The building had learned how to exist alongside its own mythology. It neither embraced nor rejected the attention. It simply endured it. Across Central Park West, Strawberry Fields continued its quiet work. The mosaic remained worn smooth by countless footsteps. Flowers appeared and vanished. Songs drifted through the trees. Generations who never knew John Lennon in life discovered him there, through ritual rather than biography. The memorial aged, not into irrelevance, but into habit. It became part of the city's emotional infrastructure. From certain windows in the Dakota, the word imagine could still be seen. The relationship between the building and the garden remained unresolved and permanent. One was closed, guarded, private. The other open, communal, porous. One represented withdrawal, the other invitation. Together, they formed a balance New York rarely achieves: space to disappear, space to remember. Edward Clark could not have foreseen any of this. He could not have imagined film crews, rock stars, or global mourning. What he understood, with remarkable clarity, was something more fundamental. Cities exhaust people. Wealth does not protect against that exhaustion. Only design can. The Dakota was his answer. A structure that absorbed friction. A building that allowed people to live close together without feeling crowded. A place where complexity was hidden so that life could feel simple. That idea proved durable enough to survive ridicule, economic pressure, cultural upheaval, and the passage of time. More than 140 years after its completion, the Dakota still fulfills that purpose. It is not frozen in the past, but anchored to it. It does not compete with the city. It waits it out. In a place defined by reinvention, the Dakota remains a reminder that permanence itself can be a form of progress. What ultimately distinguishes the Dakota is not any single event that occurred within its walls, but the continuity that followed. Buildings are usually defined by moments: a grand opening, a scandal, a demolition narrowly avoided. The Dakota has experienced all of these, yet none of them define it completely. Its identity rests instead on endurance, on the rare ability to remain itself while everything around it changes. From the beginning, the building resisted easy categorization. It was neither hotel nor townhouse, neither palace nor tenement. It asked its residents to accept a new social arrangement, one built on trust in systems rather than servants, on shared structure rather than private isolation. That arrangement proved resilient because it aligned with something deeper than fashion. It aligned with human fatigue, the desire to live well without constant vigilance, the wish for comfort that does not require performance. As New York entered the late 20th century, those desires only intensified. The city grew louder, faster, more exposed. Technology collapsed distance while increasing intrusion. Wealth became more visible, more volatile, more public. In that environment, the Dakota's refusal to modernize aggressively became a form of protection. It did not chase relevance. It waited for relevance to come back to it. Inside the building, the routines of daily life continued quietly. Residents learned one another's rhythms without demanding intimacy. The culture favored acknowledgement over familiarity, respect over access. Children grew up understanding that privacy was not secrecy, but courtesy. That silence was not emptiness, but agreement. The cooperative structure reinforced this ethic. Ownership carried obligation. Decisions were slow, often frustratingly so, but deliberate. Change was possible, but only when necessity outweighed disruption. This conservatism was not nostalgia. It was stewardship. Outside, the Dakota continued to absorb meaning far beyond its physical boundaries. It appeared in documentaries, books, photographs, films. It became shorthand for a certain kind of New York, older, heavier, inward-facing. A city that once believed permanence mattered. People projected onto it what they felt the city was losing. Yet for those who lived inside, the building was not symbolic. It was practical. Elevators still ran. Heat still rose through radiators. Courtyard stones still echoed underfoot. Life was not lived in legend, but in routine. Across the street, Strawberry Fields continued to function as its counterpoint. Open, vulnerable, communal. The garden absorbed grief that had nowhere else to go. It allowed strangers to share a moment without explanation. Over time, it ceased to be only about John Lennon. It became a place for mourning, reflection, and quiet solidarity. A reminder that cities are not only built of stone and steel, but of memory. The Dakota and the garden remain bound together by proximity and contrast. One closed, one open, one guarded, one given. One shaped by architecture, the other by participation. Together, they reflect the dual nature of urban life, the need to withdraw, the need to connect. Edward Clarke's vision survives in this balance. He did not set out to create myth. He set out to solve a problem. How to live comfortably in a dense city without surrendering dignity or peace. His solution was architectural, but its impact proved cultural. The Dakota did not merely house residents. It taught the city a new way to imagine home. That lesson has echoed quietly ever since. In an era when buildings are often conceived as investments first and environments second, the Dakota stands as a reminder that design can shape behavior, that systems can protect humanity rather than overwhelm it. Its walls do not shout, they absorb. Its gates do not advertise, they select. Its history does not demand attention. It waits for those willing to listen. The city will continue to change. Towers will rise and fall. Fortunes will be made and lost. But the Dakota remains, not as a relic, but as a reference point. Proof that some ideas, once built carefully enough, do not expire. It was never simply an apartment house. It was a proposition about how life might be lived. And more than a century later, that proposition still stands. Standing at the edge of Central Park West today, it is easy to forget how improbable the Dakota once seemed. The city has grown up around it, softening its defiance, normalizing its presence. What was once wilderness is now among the most desirable neighborhoods in the world. The elevated railway is gone, replaced by traffic and towers. The skepticism that greeted the building has faded into legend. Yet, the Dakota itself remains unchanged in spirit, still operating according to assumptions formed in the 19th century. Its continued relevance is not accidental. The building survives because it was designed around human limits. Edward Clark understood that wealth did not eliminate fatigue, that comfort required more than decoration. He built a structure that absorbed labor, noise, and complexity so that life inside could feel composed. That principle has outlasted every trend that followed it. Modern luxury buildings promise amenities, but they rarely promise quiet. They trade permanence for flexibility, discretion for visibility. The Dakota does the opposite. It offers fewer conveniences by contemporary standards, but it offers something far rarer: predictability, stability, a sense that one's home will not reinvent itself every decade in pursuit of relevance. This is why the building continues to attract residents who value withdrawal over display. People whose lives already involve exposure often seek spaces that resist it. The Dakota does not flatter ambition, it dampens it. It does not reward speed, it slows it down. In a city that demands constant performance, the building offers relief from being watched. That relief comes at a price. Financially, the cost of living within its walls is immense. Socially, the expectations are exacting. The cooperative board remains vigilant, not because it seeks exclusivity for its own sake, but because the building's equilibrium depends on shared restraint. One disruptive presence can fracture the delicate balance Clark designed. Privacy here is collective, not individual. It survives only if everyone agrees to protect it. This culture has allowed the Dakota to endure without becoming a museum. It is not frozen. Repairs are made. Systems are updated cautiously. But change is absorbed rather than announced. Residents live with the awareness that they are temporary custodians of something older and larger than themselves. Outside, the building continues to accumulate meaning. Tourists photograph the entrance daily. Guides recount stories of film shoots and famous residents. Some visitors arrive seeking tragedy. Others seek inspiration. The Dakota accommodates all of this silently. It does not correct misconceptions or clarify its history. It allows the city to project whatever it needs onto its facade. Across the street, Strawberry Fields continues to evolve in its own way. The garden changes subtly each year as plants grow, die, and are replaced. The mosaic remains worn smooth by millions of footsteps. The gatherings ebb and flow with anniversaries and news cycles. What began as a memorial has become a ritual space, not tied to any single generation. Together, the building and the garden form a dialogue that never resolves. One protects life from intrusion. The other invites the world in. One is guarded. The other is open. Between them lies a street that carries traffic, memory, and time. This tension reflects New York itself, a city built on contradiction, public and private, ambition and retreat, reinvention, and preservation. The Dakota does not attempt to resolve these forces, it simply holds its position among them. Edward Clark did not live to see what his building became. He could not have imagined its role in cinema, music, or global mourning. But he understood something essential: that cities would grow denser, that privacy would become more valuable, not less, that architecture could shape behavior long after its creator was gone. The Dakota stands as proof of that belief, not because it is famous, not because it is expensive, but because it still functions exactly as intended. It still absorbs the city so that those inside can live apart from it. In a place defined by constant change, that may be its most radical achievement. In the end, the Dakota's significance lies not in how loudly it announces itself, but in how quietly it persists. It has never relied on novelty or reinvention to justify its existence. Instead, it has allowed time to do the work of validation. Each decade that passes without its disappearance strengthens the argument Edward Clark made more than a century ago: that thoughtful design can outlast fashion, and that restraint can be a form of power. The building's physical presence reinforces this idea. Its masonry does not shimmer or reflect the sky. It absorbs light rather than broadcasting it. The walls feel deliberate, almost stubborn, as though they were meant to resist not only weather, but impatience. The Dakota does not invite attention. It endures it. That endurance has shaped how residents experience the city. Living within its walls means participating in an unspoken agreement. Noise is minimized. Curiosity is restrained. Fame is treated as incidental. Neighbors are acknowledged without being interrogated. This culture did not arise by chance. It emerged because the building made certain behaviors easier and others uncomfortable. Architecture became social instruction. Over time, this quiet discipline has created something rare in New York: continuity. In most buildings, residents cycle through rapidly, leaving little trace. At the Dakota, lives overlap for decades. Stories accumulate. Hallways remember footsteps. Apartments carry the imprint of previous occupants without becoming static. The building is lived in, not consumed. This continuity has protected it from the fate of so many historic structures. It was never abandoned long enough to decay, never emptied long enough to justify replacement. Its value was not theoretical. It was daily. People needed it, not as an idea, but as a functioning refuge. Even moments of rupture failed to undo it. The near demolition of the early 1960s could have erased the Dakota entirely. Instead, it clarified its importance. The tenants who fought to save it did so not because it was beautiful alone, but because it worked. It had given them a life that could not be replicated elsewhere. Ownership transformed that attachment into responsibility. Preservation became personal. The same was true after 1980. John Lennon's death could have frozen the building in tragedy. It could have overwhelmed its identity. Instead, the Dakota absorbed the loss as it absorbed everything else, quietly, without ceremony. Life continued inside even as the world mourned outside. The building did not become a shrine. It remained a home. This distinction matters. Shrines belong to the public. Homes belong to the living. The Dakota has always insisted on that difference. Across Central Park West, Strawberry Fields serves the opposite function. It invites grief, memory, and participation. It offers no protection from emotion. It exists precisely so that feeling can spill outward. The Dakota does not compete with this. It complements it. One contains, the other releases. Together, they form a rare equilibrium, a place to retreat and a place to gather, a structure that guards silence and a garden that welcomes sound. Few cities manage such balance intentionally. New York achieved it almost accidentally, through tragedy layered onto foresight. As the city moves further into the 21st century, pressures on buildings like the Dakota intensify. Real estate values soar. Technology reshapes daily life. Privacy becomes harder to defend. Yet the building remains resistant to urgency. Decisions are still slow. Access is still limited. The past is still treated as something to be lived with, not erased. This resistance is not stubbornness for its own sake. It is fidelity to purpose. Edward Clark did not build the Dakota to impress his contemporaries. He built it to solve a problem he believed would only grow larger. How to live well in a crowded city without surrendering dignity, privacy, or peace. That problem has not disappeared. If anything, it has sharpened. The Dakota's continued existence suggests that the solution Clark proposed was not merely adequate, but enduring. A building that absorbs complexity so that life inside can remain simple. A place where the city stops at the gate. A structure that does not ask to be admired, only to be respected. In a metropolis defined by ambition and exposure, the Dakota offers something quieter and more difficult to achieve. The permission to withdraw without vanishing. The ability to belong without being seen. That was Clark's vision. And more than a century later, it remains intact. The Dakota's endurance is often explained through wealth, celebrity, or preservation law, but those explanations only describe the surface. The deeper reason it remains intact is cultural. The building has always demanded something from the people who live inside it. Not admiration, not loyalty, but restraint. From the beginning, the Dakota imposed limits. It limited noise through thick walls. It limited intrusion through controlled access. It limited visibility by turning life inward toward courtyards and corridors rather than outward toward the street. These constraints shaped behavior long before they became values. Residents adapted to the building rather than reshaping it to themselves. Over time, that adaptation became tradition. In a city where individuality is often expressed through display, the Dakota encourages anonymity. Not erasure, but discretion. Lives unfold without announcement. Success is not advertised. Failure is not exposed. The building does not reward performance. It absorbs it. This has allowed different generations to inhabit the same spaces without conflict. Industrialists gave way to artists. Artists gave way to financiers. Financiers lived alongside musicians and writers. The building did not need to choose between them because it never defined itself by who lived there. It defined itself by how life was conducted. That distinction is why the Dakota has survived periods that erased other landmarks. It was not dependent on a single social class or economic model. It was adaptable without being flexible, stable without being rigid. The core idea remained intact even as the surface details shifted. Preservation law eventually formalized this stability, but it did not create it. By the time the city designated the Dakota a landmark, its survival instinct was already deeply ingrained. Residents had learned to think in decades rather than years. Repairs were measured against longevity. Decisions were weighed against continuity. Change was not rejected, but it was never allowed to dominate. The cooperative board became the guardian of this mindset. Its authority was often misunderstood as elitism, but its function was structural. The building could not tolerate constant churn without losing its character. Privacy depended on familiarity. Silence depended on mutual respect. The board's role was to protect the environment Clark had designed, not to curate a social roster. This is why rejection at the Dakota is rarely personal, even when it feels that way. The question is not who someone is, but how they live. Whether they understand that the building's greatest luxury is not space or history, but containment. The promise that life inside will remain insulated from the city's appetite for exposure. Outside, the city continues to press in. Traffic thickens. property values rise, tourism intensifies. The Dakota absorbs these pressures without yielding to them. Its gates remain narrow, its courtyard remains enclosed, its windows look outward without inviting entry. Across the street, Strawberry Fields continues its quiet evolution. The memorial has outlived the moment that created it, becoming a permanent fixture of the city's emotional geography. Visitors arrive without instruction. They sit, they sing, they leave offerings. The garden requires no explanation. It functions because it was designed for participation rather than control. The relationship between the building and the garden remains unresolved, and that is precisely why it works. One exists to protect life from intrusion. The other exists to receive it. One is governed. The other is shared. Together, they form a rare balance between private endurance and public memory. The Dakota's story is often told through dramatic moments: its near demolition, its role in cinema, the death of John Lennon. These moments are real, and they matter, but they are interruptions rather than definitions. What defines the building is everything that happened in between. The years of ordinary life, the routines that repeated, the quiet decisions that preserved the whole. Edward Clark could not have known the details of what would follow. He could not have foreseen film crews, paparazzi, or memorial gardens. What he understood was structural: that cities would grow more crowded, that privacy would become scarcer, that comfort would require systems rather than servants, that dignity could be designed. The Dakota stands as evidence that he was right. It has not remained because it is old, or beautiful, or famous. It has remained because it works. It still performs the task it was built to perform. It still absorbs the city so that those inside can live apart from it. In New York, where almost everything eventually becomes negotiable, the Dakota remains firm. Not defiant, not nostalgic, simply consistent. A building that does not explain itself. A place that does not ask to be understood, only to be left intact. And in that quiet persistence, it continues to fulfill the promise made when it first rose from an empty stretch of land: that it would outlast doubt, that it would make density livable, that it would allow people to live close together without surrendering themselves. That promise, more than any legend attached to its walls, is why the Dakota still stands. What remains remarkable is how little the Dakota has needed to justify itself. It has never mounted an argument for its own importance. It has simply continued. In a city where survival often requires reinvention, the building has relied instead on coherence. Its parts still serve the purpose for which they were designed. Its culture still reinforces that purpose. Time has tested it, and time has not undone it. The pressures facing New York today are different in form, but familiar in substance. Density has increased beyond what Edward Clark could have imagined. Technology has erased boundaries between public and private life. Wealth has become louder, more performative, more transient. Buildings are marketed as experiences rather than environments. Luxury is measured in visibility rather than comfort. Against this backdrop, the Dakota feels almost oppositional. It does not offer spectacle. It does not promise reinvention. It does not frame itself as an asset class or a lifestyle brand. It offers something narrower and more difficult to sustain: a controlled environment in which daily life is allowed to proceed without constant interruption. A place where architecture quietly enforces restraint rather than encouraging display. This restraint is often misunderstood. Outsiders interpret it as exclusion, secrecy, or severity. In reality, it functions as protection. The Dakota does not exist to impress the city. It exists to shield its residents from it. That distinction has become increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. The building's longevity has also altered how it is perceived. What once seemed eccentric now appears prescient. Features that critics once mocked, thick walls, inward-facing courtyards, deliberate separation of functions, now read as solutions to problems the modern city still struggles to address: noise, overexposure, the erosion of privacy, the fatigue of constant proximity. Edward Clark did not build the Dakota to preserve the past. He built it to anticipate the future. That future arrived slowly, then all at once. The city caught up to his assumptions, and in doing so, validated them. This is why the Dakota does not feel like a relic. It feels like an outlier that time has not yet overtaken. Its relevance is not nostalgic, it is practical. People still seek what it offers, because the need it addressed has not disappeared. If anything, it has intensified. Across Central Park West, Strawberry Fields continues to receive the world's attention. It absorbs grief, memory, and longing without condition. It belongs to everyone. The Dakota belongs to no one who does not live within it. This separation is essential. It allows each space to function without compromising the other. One gathers, one contains. Together, they reflect two responses to the same city. One open, one closed. One public, one private. Neither negates the other. Both are necessary. The Dakota's refusal to resolve this tension is part of its strength. It does not attempt to reconcile memory with daily life. It allows them to coexist without explanation. Residents can look out across the park and see the mosaic, the flowers, the people gathered in quiet communion. Then they can turn away and return to the routines of ordinary life. Both experiences are held without collapse. This capacity to hold complexity without spectacle is rare. It is architectural, but it is also cultural. It requires shared discipline. It requires limits. It requires an understanding that not everything needs to be seen, shared, or consumed. That understanding has allowed the Dakota to endure without becoming brittle. It has weathered tragedy without becoming a shrine. It has weathered fame without becoming a stage. It has weathered wealth without becoming hollow. It has remained a place to live. More than a century after its completion, the building still fulfills the function Edward Clark envisioned. It absorbs the city so that life inside can remain composed. It offers continuity in a place defined by flux. It allows people to live close together without being forced into one another's lives. The Dakota does not ask to be admired. It does not seek interpretation. It does not explain itself. It stands. And in a city where standing still is often impossible, that may be the most enduring achievement of all. There is a temptation to view the Dakota as an exception, a singular anomaly that could never be repeated. But that interpretation misses its deeper lesson. The building was not successful because it was extravagant or historic or rare. It succeeded because it was intentional. Every choice embedded in its design served a clear philosophy about how people live together and how they protect themselves from one another without withdrawing entirely. Edward Clark did not design for spectacle. He designed for longevity. He assumed that residents would change, that fortunes would rise and fall, that the city would grow louder and more crowded. What he did not assume was that human tolerance for noise, exposure, and disruption would expand to match it. The Dakota was built around the idea that it would not. That assumption has proven correct. The modern city offers countless forms of convenience, but few forms of refuge. Transparency is celebrated. Access is rewarded. Boundaries are treated as obstacles rather than safeguards. In that environment, the Dakota's refusal to open itself fully to the outside world feels almost radical. It insists that some spaces must remain protected if they are to function at all. This protection is not rooted in fear. It is rooted in clarity. The building knows what it is for. It is not a destination. It is not an attraction. It is not a symbol waiting to be activated. It is a place where people live ordinary lives under extraordinary conditions of restraint. That restraint has shaped generations. Children raised within the Dakota learned early that curiosity has limits, that privacy is not secrecy, but respect. Adults learned that discretion is not absence, but presence without intrusion. These lessons were not taught explicitly. They were absorbed through repetition, reinforced by architecture, culture, and shared expectation. Few buildings manage this. Most rely on rules alone. The Dakota relies on alignment between structure and behavior. Its thick walls reduce conflict before it begins. Its inward-facing spaces discourage spectacle. Its controlled access removes the need for constant vigilance. People behave differently because the building makes it easier to do so. This is why the Dakota has resisted commodification more successfully than most luxury properties. It cannot be reduced to an image or an amenity list. Its value lies in how it feels over time, not how it presents itself at a moment. That kind of value is difficult to advertise and impossible to scale. Outside, the city continues to reinterpret the building according to its needs. It becomes a backdrop for tours, a reference point in cultural memory, a symbol of old New York. None of these interpretations are wrong. They are simply incomplete. The Dakota does not exist to be understood from the sidewalk. It exists to function from the inside. Across the street, Strawberry Fields continues to offer the opposite experience. It invites pause rather than withdrawal. It asks nothing of those who enter it except attention. People arrive carrying grief, nostalgia, or curiosity, and leave having shared space with strangers who feel the same pull. The memorial remains open because it must be. Its purpose is exposure. The Dakota's purpose is containment. That these two spaces coexist so closely is not a contradiction. It is a rare equilibrium. The city is large enough to hold both, a place to remember openly and a place to live quietly, a space where emotion gathers and a structure where life continues. Edward Clark did not design a monument. He designed a system. That system has absorbed tragedy, fame, economic pressure, and time itself without collapsing. It has required maintenance, vigilance, and sacrifice, but it has not required reinvention. Its core logic remains sound. As New York continues to change, the Dakota stands as a reminder that progress does not always mean acceleration. Sometimes it means refinement. Sometimes it means restraint. Sometimes it means building something so carefully that it does not need to explain itself for generations. The Dakota has outlived the doubts that greeted it, the family that built it, the world that surrounded it at birth. It remains not because it is protected, but because it is needed. It still performs the work it was designed to perform. It still shelters lives from the city's demands without cutting them off from the city itself. That is not nostalgia. It is function. And as long as cities exhaust the people who live within them, there will be value in places that understand how to absorb that exhaustion rather than amplify it. The Dakota understood this from the beginning. That understanding, more than any story attached to its walls, is why it endures. Time has a way of clarifying intention. What once seemed excessive, even eccentric, often reveals itself later as necessary. The Dakota has benefited from this long view. Each passing decade has stripped away the novelty of its origins and left behind the clarity of its purpose. It was never designed to impress a moment. It was designed to endure conditions that had not yet fully arrived. Those conditions define the modern city: crowding without intimacy, visibility without connection, proximity without relief. As urban life became increasingly compressed, the Dakota's original assumptions gained relevance rather than losing it. The building had anticipated the psychological cost of density long before it became a subject of study. It recognized that people could live close together only if they were given space to withdraw. That withdrawal was not isolation, it was modulation. Inside the Dakota, the city is filtered rather than excluded. Sounds arrive softened. Light enters indirectly. Movement is slowed by design. These effects accumulate subtly. Residents do not notice them day to day, but over time they shape experience. Life feels less reactive. Decisions feel less urgent. The city exists, but it does not dominate. This quality cannot be replicated easily. It is not the result of any single feature, but of alignment. Architecture, management, and culture reinforce one another. When one weakens, the others compensate. When pressure mounts, the system absorbs it rather than transmitting it inward. This alignment explains why the Dakota has resisted both decay and over-improvement. Many historic buildings suffer from neglect or from excessive modernization. The Dakota avoided both extremes because neither served its core logic. Neglect would compromise comfort. Excessive modernization would compromise restraint. The building required care, not transformation. That philosophy has guided decisions for generations. Repairs are made when necessary, not when fashionable. Technologies are integrated cautiously, often invisibly. Change is permitted only when it preserves function rather than alters identity. This has frustrated outsiders who expect luxury to announce itself loudly. Inside the Dakota, luxury is measured by absence. Absence of noise, absence of disruption, absence of explanation. This approach extends to social life as well. Residents coexist without spectacle. Familiarity develops slowly, often over years. There is little incentive to perform because performance finds no audience. The building does not reward display. It rewards consistency. This consistency has allowed the Dakota to remain legible to itself even as its public image multiplied. To some, it is a film location. To others, a site of pilgrimage. To still others, a symbol of exclusion or privilege. None of these perceptions alter the daily reality inside. The building does not correct misunderstanding. It does not curate its reputation. It allows interpretation to happen at a distance. Across the street, Strawberry Fields continues to gather those interpretations into something communal. The memorial absorbs emotion that has nowhere else to go. It does not belong to any single narrative. It belongs to use, to repetition, to shared presence. It grows worn because it is touched. It remains meaningful because it is entered. The Dakota does not offer that kind of access. It was never meant to. Its contribution is different. It demonstrates that privacy can be sustained without withdrawal from the city entirely. That density does not require exposure. That a building can participate in urban life without surrendering control over how that participation occurs. Edward Clark did not articulate these ideas in manifestos or treatises. He embedded them in stone, corridors, and systems. He trusted that form would outlast explanation, that people would feel the difference even if they could not name it. That trust was well placed. More than a century later, the Dakota still performs the same quiet work. It reduces friction. It contains complexity. It offers continuity in a place where continuity is rare. It allows lives to unfold without requiring them to be seen. This does not make it superior to other forms of living. It makes it specific. It fulfills a need that remains unmet elsewhere. As cities continue to grow denser and more exposed, that need becomes clearer rather than fading. The Dakota does not claim to be a model for all urban housing. It does not suggest that everyone should live this way. It demonstrates that someone can, that an alternative exists. That restraint can be designed, protected, and sustained across generations. In the end, the building's greatest achievement may be this. It made space for ordinary life to continue quietly under extraordinary conditions. It allowed people to live in the center of a city without being consumed by it. It absorbed the pressures of its environment so thoroughly that those inside rarely needed to think about them. That is not spectacle. It is service, and it remains quietly intact long after louder ideas have exhausted themselves.